Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in Sophomore English. We continue in our study, we finish in our study actually of Unit 3 and the informal essay and our comparing of literary works. I'm with you on page 595 in Scott Momaday's The Way to Rainy Mountain. By the way, this is just a cutting from The Way to Rainy Mountain. Before we get there, I just want to remind you two things for 2B. One, we are comparing the literary works, the Uchida text that we just worked with, Desert Exile, and the In Scott Momaday work. We'll be looking at both of these from the perspective of author's purpose. So I'm with you back on 584 for just a second. Just to remind, author's purpose, you should have this written down in 2B. His or her author's main reason for writing, right? A writer may have more than one purpose for writing. Generally, however, one purpose is the most important. As we were saying in our previous discussion of the Uchida text, obviously there it has a lot to do with knowing or understanding what the experience of the internment camps were like for Japanese Americans. Let's turn to now on page 585 in Scott Momaday, born in 1935, growing up on the Native American reservations where his parents taught. In Scott Momaday's learned the traditions of his father's Kiowa culture as well as those of the Navajo, Apache, Pueblo Indians. At the same time, he received a modern education. Quote, he says, "I grew up in two worlds and straddled both those worlds even now." He says, he continues, quote, "It has made for confusion and richness in my life," end quote. Momaday has made much of this richness, celebrating Native American traditions, novels, poetry, essays. His first novel, Housemaid of Dawn, received a Pulitzer Prize. And again, I hope our study here of this brief cutting will lead you to have more interest in the work of In Scott Momaday. Let's begin with some background information on 595. By the way, because we live in Wyoming, this cutting for us will bring us much closer to home. So let's pay attention now to the background information. Like other Great Plains tribes, the Kiowa were buffalo hunters. When white settlers came to the plains, the Kiowa fought them. By the late 1800s, however, the United States troops had broken Kiowa resistance, and white hunters had all but exterminated the buffalo. Traditional Kiowa life came to an end. In 1868, the Kiowas went to live on a reservation in southwestern Oklahoma. Like our comments regarding the previous title, here again, we will say out loud that while America is great and an exceptional country, we do have moments in our history that are tragic, that are shameful. And this is one of those, without doubt. We'll now turn to this reading and get some sense of author's purpose. What is it that Momaday wants for you as a reader to appreciate and understand? I'm on 595. Not a long reading, but I think a powerful reading. Let's go to work with it, shall we?
From The Way to Rainy Mountain by N. Scott Momaday. A single knoll rises out of the plain in Oklahoma, north and west of the Wichita Range. For my people, the Kiowas, it is an old landmark, and they gave it the name Rainy Mountain. The hardest weather in the world is there. Winter brings blizzards. Hot tornadic winds arise in the spring, and in summer the prairie is an anvil's edge.
596.
The grass turns brittle and brown, and it cracks beneath your feet. There are green belts along the rivers and creeks, linear groves of hickory and pecan, willow and witch hazel. At a distance in July or August, the steaming foliage seems almost to writhe in fire. Great green and yellow grasshoppers are everywhere in the tall grass, popping up like corn to sting the flesh. And tortoises crawl about on the red earth, going nowhere in the plenty of time. Loneliness is an aspect of the land. All things in the plain are isolate. There is no confusion of objects in the eye, but one hill, or one tree, or one man. To look upon that landscape in the early morning, with the sun at your back, is to lose the sense of proportion. Your imagination comes to life, and this, you think, is where creation was begun.
Okay, let's pause. Just for a moment, notice at level 1, he begins with setting. Write down for you, what's the most compelling bit of that setting? Whatever it was that he said. Notice some will say at a distance on page 596, in July or August, the steaming foliage seems almost to writhe in fire. Some will write down, loneliness is an aspect of the land. What does it mean to have a sad land? What does that even mean to you? Sad land, lonely land. Notice all of this now is setting us up for what will come next. Where the author, remember this is an essay, where the author will then inject himself into the essay. Let's watch.
I returned to Rainy Mountain in July. My grandmother had died in the spring, and I wanted to be at her grave. She had lived to be very old, and at last, infirm. Her only living daughter was with her when she died, and I was told that in death, her face was that of a child. I like to think of her as a child. When she was born, the Kiowas were living the last great moment of their history. For more than 100 years, they had controlled the open range from the Smoky Hill River to the Red, from the headwaters of the Canadian to the fork of the Arkansas and Cimarron.
597.
In alliance with the Comanches, they had ruled the whole of the southern plains. War was their sacred business, and they were among the finest horsemen the world has ever known. But warfare for the Kiowas was preeminently a matter of disposition rather than of survival, and they never understood the grim, unrelenting advance of the U.S. cavalry. When at last, divided and ill-provisioned, they were driven onto the staked plains in the cold rains of autumn, they fell into panic. In Palo Duro Canyon, they abandoned their crucial stores to pillage and had nothing then but their lives. In order to save themselves, they surrendered to the soldiers at Fort Sill and were imprisoned in the old stone corral that now stands as a military museum. My grandmother was spared the humiliation of those high gray walls by 8 or 10 years. But she must have known from birth the affliction of defeat, the dark brooding of old warriors. Her name was Aho, and she belonged to the last culture to evolve in North America. Her forebears came down from the high country in western Montana nearly 3 centuries ago. They were a mountain people, a mysterious tribe of hunters whose language has never been positively classified in any major group. In the late 17th century, they began a long migration to the south and east. It was a journey toward the dawn, and it led to a golden age. Along the way, the Kiowas were befriended by the Crows, who gave them the culture and religion of the plains. They acquired horses, and their ancient nomadic spirit was suddenly free of the ground. They acquired Taimi, the sacred Sundance doll. From that moment, the object and symbol of their worship, and so shared in the divinity of the sun. Not least, they acquired the sense of destiny, therefore courage and pride. When they entered upon the southern plains, they had been transformed. No longer were they slaves to the simple necessity of survival. They were a lordly and dangerous society of fighters and thieves, hunters and priests of the sun. According to their origin myth, they entered the world through a hollow log. From one point of view, their migration was the fruit of an old prophecy. For indeed, they emerged from a sunless world.
All right, let's pause. Write it down at level 1. Notice what Momaday now will give to us. History, right, of the peoples of his grandmother. The idea that this is a peoples who began north of us even in Montana, and ultimately found their way then down onto the southern plains. Notice by the 17th century we're told they have a language that hasn't been classified. They have a golden age. Along with the Crow Indians, they are able to gain a sense of identity through their religion, and more particularly the Taime, the sacred Sundance. They have a sense of destiny. This is the story of a people who are, we're told, strong and proud, and they are going to have courage. Tremendous courage. Some of the best horsemen that ever lived, Momaday will argue. And all of that, along with their origination myth, this is what we call cosmogonic stories. That is to say, where we come from, our origination stories. In your junior year, by the way, make a note at 3A. In your junior year, you're going to have some similar stories that you'll begin your study in the anthology of American literature. We'll begin there, actually, with some of those amazing creation, cosmogonic stories, where we came from. Notice now on to page 598, we'll have some information about a part of the world that you know quite a bit about, right? Well, pay attention.
Although my grandmother lived out her long life in the shadow of Rainy Mountain, the immense landscape of the continental interior lay like memory in her blood. She could tell of the Crows, whom she had never seen, and of the Black Hills, where she had never been. I wanted to see in reality what she had seen more perfectly in the mind's eye, and traveled 1,500 miles to begin my pilgrimage. Yellowstone, it seemed to me, was the top of the world, a region of deep lakes and dark timber, canyons and waterfalls. But beautiful as it is, one might have the sense of confinement there. The skyline in all directions is close at hand, the high wall of the woods and deep cleavages of shade. There is a perfect freedom in the mountains, but it belongs to the eagle and the elk, the badger and the bear. The Kiowas reckoned their stature by the distance they could see, and they were bent and blind in the wilderness. Descending eastward, the highland meadows are a stairway to the plain. In July, the inland slope of the Rockies is luxuriant with flax and buckwheat, stonecrop and larkspur. The earth unfolds, and the limit of the land recedes. Clusters of trees and animals grazing far in the distance cause the vision to reach away and wonder to build upon the mind. The sun follows a longer course in the day, and the sky is immense beyond all comparison. The great billowing clouds that sail upon it are shadows that move upon the brain like water, dividing light. Farther down, in the land of the Crows and Blackfeet, the plain is yellow. Sweet clover takes hold of the hills and bends upon itself to cover and seal the soil. There, the Kiowas paused on their way. They had come to the place where they must change their lives. The sun is at home on the plains. Precisely there does it have the certain character of a god. When the Kiowas came to the land of the Crows, they could see the dark leaves of the hills at dawn across the Bighorn River, the profusion of light on the grain shelves, the oldest deity ranging after the solstices. Not yet would they veer southward to the cauldron of the land that lay below. They must wean their blood from the northern winter and hold the mountains a while longer in their view. They bore Taime in procession to the east.
Okay, let's pause. Pay attention now to the use of his word pilgrimage. He wants to go back to the source of so much of Kiowa culture. Although his grandma never actually got to see it, she saw it in her mind's eye. She knew about this place, and so he goes back. Notice he begins in the Yellowstone. And of course, for those of us that have spent any time in the Yellowstone, we know exactly what it is that he's describing. It feels very confined. All of the woods, the mountains, Notice then the next series of sentences tell us about how the Kiowa then left and came south into the plains. And once they were there in the plains, they were ready, notice he tells us, to begin to change their lives. That is to say, their life and the way they thought of their life. Here was a place for their gods. Here was a place for the sun to shine. Now on to page 599, of course, a picture of Devil's Tower there at the top of the page, a place that many of you have visited because we live so close to it. Some interesting history going on here as well. Let's enjoy.
A dark mist lay over the black hills, and the land was like iron. At the top of a ridge, I caught sight of Devil's Tower upthrust against the gray sky, as if in the birth of time the core of the earth had broken through its crust, and the motion of the world was begun. There are things in nature that engender an awful quiet in the heart of man. Devil's Tower is one of them. 2 centuries ago, because they could not do otherwise, the Kiowas made a legend at the base of the rock. My grandmother said,
notice now a legend, a story.
8 children were there at play, 7 sisters and their brother. Suddenly, the boy was struck dumb. He trembled and began to run upon his hands and feet. His fingers became claws, and his body was covered with fur. Directly there was a bear where the boy had been. The sisters were terrified. They ran, and the bear after them. They came to the stump of a great tree, and the tree spoke to them. It bade them climb upon it, and as they did so, it began to rise in the air. The bear came to kill them, but they were just beyond its reach. It reared against the tree and scored the bark all around with its claws. The 7 sisters were born into the sky, and they became the stars of the Big Dipper. From that moment, and so long as the legend lives, the Kiowas have kinsmen in the night sky. Whatever they were in the mountains, they could be no more. However tenuous their well-being, however much they had suffered and would suffer again, they had found a way out of the wilderness.
There's, of course, a whole lot of debate. You can Google this on your own about the fact that that monument that's pictured at the top of 599 is called Devil's Tower, a term that obviously is applied by the white man when the white man comes to this place. A misrepresentation in many ways of the legend. There's the legend, the story, of course, of the bear that's trying to chase the children and scours them with its claws. And for those of us that have been to this area of Devil's Tower, we know it is truly remarkable. I want to go back to this amazing line on 599. He says, there are things in nature, and this may be the thesis of this passage, and this certainly is one of the 2A observations. There are things in nature that engender an awful quiet in the heart of man. Devil's Tower is one of them. The first time that you see Devil's Tower, of course, you cannot help but be silent. It just kind of blows you away with awe. It's like nothing that you've ever seen in your life, or you ever will see probably in your life. All right, let's jump on to page 600. Back to his grandma one more time, right? A tribute, no doubt. A tribute essay to his grandma, no doubt.
My grandmother had a reverence for the sun, a holy regard that now is all but gone out of mankind. There was a wariness in her and an ancient awe. She was a Christian in her later years, but she had come a long way about, and she never forgot her birthright. As a child, she had been to the Sundances. She had taken part in those annual rites, and by them she had learned the restoration of her people in the presence of Taimi. She was about 7 when the last Kiowa Sundance was held in 1887 on the Washita River above Rainy Mountain Creek. The buffalo were gone. In order to consummate the ancient sacrifice, to impale the head of a buffalo bull upon the medicine tree, a delegation of old men journeyed into Texas there to beg and barter for an animal from the goodnight herd. She was 10 when the Kiowas came together for the last time as a living Sundance culture. They could find no buffalo. They had to hang an old hide from the sacred tree. Before the dance could begin, a company of soldiers rode out from Fort Sill under orders to disperse the tribe. Forbidden without cause the essential act of their faith, having seen the wild herds slaughtered and left to rot upon the ground, the Kiowas backed away forever from the medicine tree. That was July 20th, 1890, at the Great Bend of the Washita. My grandmother was there. Without bitterness, and for as long as she lived, she bore a vision of deicide.
All right, let's go ahead and write this one down. This is, of course, a tragic part of our cutting. He tells the story of what it was like when these people who have been now relocated down into Oklahoma are wanting to honor their sacred right and not allowed to do so. Notice we've got a date there, July 20th, 1890. Notice, without bitterness and for as long as she lived, my grandmother bore a vision of deicide. Let's write that word down, deicide, the killing of a god. And in the process, the argument often is the killing of the heart of a culture. Obviously, darkly tragic, right? Let's keep going now. What happens next? What else are we going to learn?
Now that I can have her only in memory, I see my grandmother in the several postures that were peculiar to her. Standing at the wood stove for a winter morning and turning meat in a great iron skillet. Sitting at the south window, bent above her beadwork. And afterwards, when her vision failed, looking down for a long time into the fold of her hands, going out upon a cane, very slowly as she did when the weight of age came upon her.